From the Peacock Original Studios in the hills above Lahaina, Maui, we bring to you a tale of moonshiners, Chicago gangsters, and a writer who lives in a barn. Kill Me Later. By Everett Peacock, at the treehouse without a tree. Bugsy never quite understood why Kentucky winters were so obnoxious. Irritating, actually, especially when it simply rained and didn't snow like Chicago. Snow didn't immediately make mud, the sticky mess that was now ruining his polished Oxfords. "How much farther?" he yelled, not as a question but more of a complaint. "This damn mud." "10 more minutes, boss." T. Ford, his driver, knew these woods well, since he had been a kid running moonshine errands on this very trail for a now deceased uncle. He also knew it well enough to not complain about mud. Or the rain. A fresh, chilling sheet of unfrozen snow began dripping from the pine trees, large dollops that had waited for enough virgin mists to accumulate before gravity pulled them reluctantly down. The hills themselves seemed miserable in this weather, silent in their suffering, patiently waiting for spring. Eventually, they rounded a bend in the soggy trail to see the moonshine stills just under the thin veil of smoke rising from their cook fires. Bugsy immediately noticed 4 men with Tommy guns well placed in the trees surrounding the path ahead of them. "We good here?" he asked T. Ford. "Hold up a second." T. Ford pulled out a large red handkerchief from his wool overcoat. He waved it over his head, left to right, then right to left, 2 times. "Now we wait, boss." Bugsy figured it was some kind of signal code. He appreciated any security they had in use. A small fortune was at risk here. Chicago money. Get yourself killed if you screw up kind of money. After a few moments, someone took a metal stirring spoon and tapped on one of the metal boiling pots. 3 times. "That's a good sound, boss." T-Ford now took out a blue handkerchief and waved it in 3 full circles above his head. A single tap on the metal boiling pot followed. "All good now?" T. Ford said, happy that this code sequence had worked out. It was the first time they had used it. "Let's go, boss. I'll introduce you to the guys." Bugsy was getting excited. He had made thousands of dollars brokering moonshine from Canada to the Carolinas. But now, if this deal worked out, he would eliminate the middleman. A grin spread across his face at the word eliminate. 2 of the Tommy gun men suddenly showed up behind Bugsy and followed them to the still. 2 others greeted them at the end of the trail, frowning like assassins are trained to do. "To Ford," a man hollered, coming from around one of the large cookpots, coughed a little, and then added, "Good morning to you, sonny." "Bubbles." T. Ford pushed past the 2 guards and in a few steps was hugging his last remaining uncle. "You look good." "Ah," Bubbles demurred, "you lie, but I love you for it." The 2 guards turned away at the friendly confirmations, heading back up into the trees to their posts. Bugsy nodded to them, a universal sign of respect to gunmen who had not shot at him. "Bubbles," T. Ford said, a happy lilt to his otherwise depressed voice. "Let me introduce you to Bugsy Jones. I've worked with him up Chicago way, and well, everywhere, since I left these fine woods here." The Chicago man stepped up, his hand held out to the man that seemed to be the decision-maker in these parts. "Sir, good to meet the legend himself." Bubbles paused, just long enough to establish a hint of suspicion. After all, the Chicago reference was foreboding. Most of those murderous bastards would rather kill than negotiate. Reaching out and squeezing the city slicker's hand as firmly as his 75-year-old grip would accommodate, he smiled as if he had already won this first round. "Glad to see the mud didn't detour ya," Bubbles teased, looking down at the fancy shoes. "Don't worry," he pointed. "It washes off after a while." Bugsy laughed, despite wanting to curse, but this was a business meeting, and compromises had to be made. "Come," Bubbles invited. "Let's have a sit and taste our product." He led Bugsy, T. Ford, and 1 guard over to a group of chairs made from tubs turned upside down, holding up burlap sacks for cushions. A large green tarp kept most of the dollops of rain away, if not the invasive mist. There were a dozen cooks going on, and probably 30 distillation setups too, and several mountain men watching them carefully while they worked. "Looks like you've invested my money well, Bubbles." T. Ford cringed at that statement, knowing how that would sound to his uncle. "Your money, yes. Thank you for that investment." Bubbles waved his hand in a sweeping motion to include everything one could see from under the top. "My pots and pans, my brewing skill, my men, my land, my distribution network, my bribes to the local cops." Bugsy got the point and nodded. "You producing about, 20 gallons a day here?" Bugsy looked around the brew camp. "Impressive." "Yesterday we did 25. Day before, 30. Bubbles reported. "Sent 15 cars in all directions this morning, before the mud." T. Ford was pouring shots of the clear hooch into 3 tin cups. The guard wasn't invited. Handing them out quickly, he sat down and listened. "Here's to a successful partnership," Bugsy offered in toast. Bubbles raised his cup and added, "And a chance to live long enough to spend all the money." He laughed, coughed a couple of times, embarrassing himself, and quickly slammed the moonshine down to suppress the third hack. Bugsy found the moonshine to be incredibly smooth, with mild hints of oak. "Oak?" he asked. "How?" Bubbles laughed and nodded. It was his signature enhancement. "Smooth, too?" "Unbelievable smooth," Bugsy agreed. "I call it cold steel rain," Bubbles emphasized. "We triple distill here, but after the second run, we let it all sit in oak barrels for a week. Then we do a reduced boil with the minimum amount of heat on the third run to keep that oak a-going." Bugsy smiled broadly. "This is really, really good news." Bubbles let that compliment rest for a moment before responding. "That's the good news, now for the bad." The Kentucky Hill Messenger community newspaper was in a small red brick building sharing a wall with a bakery on one side and a vacant lot on the other. The little town of Destination had not quite lived up to its name from a century before, but it thrived on timber harvesting, a little coal mining from private property, and a healthy black market in moonshine distribution. The mayor, the sheriff, the other 2 officers, and everyone who enjoyed the intoxication with a hint of oak knew all about it, approved of it, mostly because they all got a healthy allotment for free each Friday afternoon. Some of the politically aware in the town also appreciated how it thumbed their noses at the feds. Laws generated up in Washington did nothing for their town, and nary $1 of federal money had ever been spent in the entire county, much less in Destination. However, there was a new journalist in town, a young man from somewhere out west, that being anything west of the Mississippi, who had a notion to expose the unethical, tax-evading, life-destroying industry of illegal moonshine production. Justin Jeremy Independence, from the Missouri town of the same surname, was a little clueless but still motivated to make a name for himself. Since the publisher, editor/owner of the small paper was out of town, JJ had decided he could print any story he was brewing on. That was yesterday. A story on the front page indicated that the hills around Destination were, and I quote here, "fouled with the stench of burnt corn and greenwood fires, laced with the poison of the very blood of the devil himself. Alcohol, the miracle that it was the smoothest moonshine that had ever been produced, apparently made no difference." Full of vigor and righteousness, feeling mighty proud of his unedited work, JJ went next door to get whatever bakery products had the most cream filling. That's when he got the first hint he may have made a mistake. "Turn yourself right around," the baker declared upon JJ's entry. "We don't serve your kind." JJ was astonished. It was only last week that he had spent the ungodly sum of $10 for donuts. "What?" JJ asked, flabbergasted. "What kind are you talking about?" The baker walked around the counter, a rolling pin in his hands. "You must be a bit daft. I don't want your theories about moonshine bringing trouble to my shop." He took a step towards JJ, slapping the smooth rolling pin into his opposite palm. "Now git." JJ quickly turned around and left, glancing back twice at the rolling pin. His focus, though, was not on the sidewalk, where he ran smack into Miss Dolly Sunshine, the local kindergarten teacher who had changed her name from Dahlia Cooper.
"Why, Mr. Independence?"
she exclaimed as he bumped her right off her left high heel.
"Watch where you are going."
She glared at him as she brought her foot up to inspect the heel.
"You're a fortunate man that it did not break."
JJ was flustered further than he could ever remember, having quickly transitioned from running away from a murderous baker to running into an attractive young woman. "Please, pardon me, Miss Sunshine, but I was told to quickly leave this establishment upon pain of being rolled." She nodded knowingly.
"Yes, I expect so. Your little article in yesterday's so-called newspaper is putting a black smudge on our fine community."
"Whatever could you be talking about?"
"You, sir, and that absolutely horrible story about moonshine corrupting nature with poison. That's the exact word you used. Poison."
JJ looked confused. Anxious to move away from the baker's shop, he asked, "Walk with me, won't you, Miss Sunshine?" She laughed.
"Not unless you're going in my direction."
"Fine," JJ turned around. "Please tell me why people don't want to talk about moonshine." Miss Sunshine, being an educator of young hill children, quickly recognized those who were challenged by the obvious, so she took a deep breath and let her teacher patience bubble up from wherever she stored that skill.
"Mr. Independent."
"Please call me JJ."
"Mr. JJ, Independence. People here don't talk about moonshine. They drink it."
She stopped and turned to look at him directly.
"They don't want anyone talking about it."
JJ shook his head as they continued to walk. "I don't get it. I mean, moonshine is bad mojo. It's polluting the streams about as bad as the coal business. It is hurting people and it's illegal." Miss Sunshine stopped walking again, looked around to see if anyone was watching. They were not, and put her finger directly against JJ's chest, poking him hard.
"You're new in town from out west, is it? Don't answer. No one cares. You got yourself a big problem now, Mr. High and Mighty No Alcohol. This town is built on moonshine. The money that is donated around supports my school, our little library, and darn near everyone's bank account in these parts."
JJ was still confused, bordering now on worried.
"You, sir, are in a heap of trouble from which you may not escape."
How was JJ going to get out of this mess? He paused a moment, swallowed his pride, and asked, "How am I going to get out of this mess, Miss Sunshine?" She continued walking, leaving him behind. Bugsy had a solution to the problem that Bubbles had just described, a Chicago solution. "How do I find this newspaper guy?" Bubbles scratched his head a bit before answering. He knew what Bugsy was thinking, and he knew it wasn't going to be pretty. In fact, it could easily bring the heat down on his operation, just as surely as the foolish words in a small-town newspaper might. "Look, Bugsy," he began, measuring his words carefully. "This ain't Chicago. I know what you's thinking of doing, and I can tell you one thing about these Kentucky hills. Such a solution won't disappear in the night shadows of some alley behind an abandoned meat-packing plant. It will scream through these hollers here for weeks, building up a rumour mill that will no doubt, in my humble opinion, bring the heat on anyhow." "Well, don't tell me you're getting soft on this stuff, Bubbles. You know what this business requires sometimes." Bubbles glanced over at T. Ford as a courtesy, decided to moderate his rage for the moment, and took the route his grandpappy would have suggested. "Look, I ain't any softer than those fancy shoes you ruined on the way in here." He stood up and began to pace the area beneath the tarp. "I've taken a few thieves to task in these hills on more than one occasion. In fact, 2 of them are planted just over that there hill." He turned and looked directly at Bugsy. "We take it step by step. We find this JJ Independence guy and rough him up a bit. Show him we're the kind of guys he needs keep his fool mouth shut about." T. Ford got all excited about roughing up a guy. It had been a while since he had broken anyone's bones. "Yeah, Bugsy, let's do that. It's been a while." The rain stopped suddenly, as if itself afraid of the beating that was coming for the foolish newspaper guy. It got real quiet, except for the cook fires and the bubbling mash pots that were singing back up to the distillation pipes, creaking with heat. A cold breeze swept through briefly, reminding Bubbles of those two guys planted just over that there hill. He stood up, found his long knife, some tobacco chew, and his hat. "Let's go then. I already know where to find him." Miss Dolly Sunshine, as young as she was, had a certain wise adventurism to her. She knew how to enjoy the first third of her life, coached as she had been by her infamous grandmother. A touch of the shine on a big moon, and roller skating night at the local rink was one of her favourites. Maybe a quick smooch with a drunk coal miner who wouldn't remembered who he had kissed. Was deliciously naughty. Yet, a man being hunted by moonshiners was a new one. The danger was somehow intoxicating. Exciting as it was, she did in fact admire the smarts this newspaper man had, despite his ill-advised decision to swim upstream in a downstream town. It took her about as long as a kindergartner's nap, a kindergartner that didn't want to nap, to figure out what she would do.
"I'll help you, Mr. JJ Independence. Yes, I will."
JJ turned back to look at her, and suddenly felt like the gloom was lifting a little. "Really, Miss Dolly?" He ran back to her and shook her offered hand. "How? Seems to me I might need to just leave town." A big smile grew across the dimples on Miss Dolly's increasingly beautiful face. Nodding, she pulled JJ in for a big hug, right there on the sidewalk, in front of God and everyone else.
"Yes.
She squeezed him a little harder.
Yes, you should, but—"
Stepping back to look JJ in the eye, her own eyes sparkled with mischief just beneath her invisible halo.
"You'll be safe as long as you're with me."
JJ was slightly flabbergasted, but without the gas part, feeling he didn't really have much of a choice, and suddenly becoming quite enamoured with Miss Dolly, as any young man would, he agreed. "My place is not far from here, Anne," he joked. "My car is even closer."
"I heard you live in a barn. Is that really true?"
The inflection in her voice was one of true curiosity, untinged with any scrap of judgment. After all, this was a big adventure brewing, where every little detail added to the thrill. JJ laughed. "Well, it is true, but I must admit I'm the only animal that lives in it." The baker, having just chased JJ out of his shop, couldn't help but see the talking and handshaking and hugging that was going on right close to his storefront window. Somehow it prompted him to make an extra dozen donuts for the after-church crowd. Teaford hadn't felt this much excitement since they had knocked off the pizza joint back in South Chicago. Breaking the legs of the tables had given him chills and thrills, but it was breaking all the glass in the picture frames on the wall that lifted his spirits on that fine evening years ago. Now, as he drove as fast as he dared, sometimes for a moment, even faster, he could sense that kind of excitement racing through his blood. This mission to catch the rogue journalist/newspaperman/communist was a righteous war to save the business Bugsy had invested so much money in. He was a believer in the cause. Teaford was, therefore, the perfect soldier. Bugsy was the perfect boss. He had enough skin in the game, money, to motivate him to move fast and hard against any and all obstacles. Plus, he knew how to dress like a Chicago boss. Oxford shoes, usually without a thick coating of Kentucky mud. A pinstripe suit, topped off with an expensive fedora hat. A gold chain snaking into a watch pocket indicated he was a rich man, but not necessarily one that cared about punctuality. Appearances equaled confidence. Gangstering was, if anything, a confidence game. Bubbles, in the back seat, was the perfect investment partner. He was old enough to understand mistakes had permanent consequences, and that his own private risk at this point in his personal timeline was irrelevant. The moonshine distillery was as big a part of him as his liver. Without either, he would soon be planted as well over that there hill. As perfectly as a Hollywood director could have scripted, T. Ford brought the 1932 Ford Model 18 V8 to a screeching stop, as much as a slightly muddy street would allow, right in front of the Kentucky Hill Messenger. Bugsy and Bubbles piled out of the black car, guns in hand, and rushed inside the offices, hell-bent on finding their man. No one was there. In fact, the place looked closed. "What the hell?" Bugsy exclaimed. The baker came running out, flour all over his hands, peering in the door to the newspaper offices. Bubbles immediately accosted the man, demanding to know where the staff were. "Were they hiding, Donut Man?" He looked over the man's shoulder. "In your place." "Gentlemen, if I may exaggerate," he said to himself. "It's Sunday." He brushed the white powder off his hands. "Besides the church, I'm the only place open." "Damn," Bubbles lamented. "My mama would be ashamed. I didn't know it was Sunday." They all walked back outside to lean on the big black car and sort out their next move. T. Ford got to sniffing the air, being in the direct draft of the warm, delicious smells wafting out of the still-open bakery door. Bugsy noticed his driver acting like a hound dog hunting an escaped prisoner and stared at him. T. Ford's eyes were getting bigger, and he involuntarily licked his lips right when Bugsy looked over. Nodding over toward the open door of the bakery, he raised his eyebrows twice. "Let's get a donut, boss." "Not now. We got us a wordsmith to catch." Turning to the baker, Bugsy pointed his Tommy gun at the flour-covered man. "Where does this miscreant newspaper guy live? And you better tell me right, 'cause we're coming back here for donuts when we're done." The doughboy didn't think twice about dooming a man to firing squad just because he made an amateur mistake. He thought 3 times, actually. Perhaps a general direction he could give, without the exact details about the little red barn off of County Road 2A, a mile past the covered bridge, close to a giant oak tree that one couldn't possibly miss, would serve the gangster enough. "I don't rightly know, but I heard it was in a barn somewhere south of town." Bugsy turned to look at Bubbles, an incredulous expression slowly turning into one of sarcasm. "Bubbles, is this how you give directions in Kentucky?" Bubbles waved them all back into the big black car. "There's only one road to the south, and there's only one barn I know of. So, Bugsy, yes, it is." Miss Dolly Sunshine was actually shaking with excitement as she walked into the shade of the little red barn. The big doors swung out. The lights inside automatically illuminated the fine pine floor. Pillows, chairs, artwork, and books. OMG. The books were everywhere.
You actually live here?
She asked out loud. JJ smiled. Yes, he did. Walking over to his writing desk, he paused and turned to his guess. She was quite attractive now that she was on adventure. Despite the murderous moonshine gangsters on his trail, things were working out just fine. Just fine indeed. "Been here for a few years, Miss Dolly."
Oh, please, just call me Dolly. We don't have to be so formal now, do we? I'm in your barn, for goodness sakes.
JJ laughed. "True, you are indeed Dolly, or do your admirers simply call you Doll?"
Oh, JJ.
She whispered, just loud enough to be heard over the roosters outside.
You can call me anything you like.
She walked over to what looked like a writer's well-stocked bar. He clicked on the light at his writing desk and pushed another button that brought the barn lights down lower while brightening the bar's crystal decanters with rainbow reflections.
What are we drinking?
She picked up an amber-coloured crystal decanter, extracted the crystal plug on top, and sniffed it lovingly.
Ooh, let's try this one.
Glancing over at JJ, she smiled broadly.
I mean, we do have to celebrate.
"T. Ford," Bubbles exclaimed, as they rocketed down the winding one-lane dirt road. "Are you a religious man?" Bugsy laughed out loud at the question, while holding on tight as they rounded another blind curve. "Not rightly," T. Ford replied. "No, sir." "Well," Bubbles replied, "seems to me you must be. You got plenty. Faith. That no one else is coming around these corners, To kill us all in a head-on crash. Bugsy lightly punched T. Ford in the shoulder. Yeah, slow down a bit. This newspaper guy ain't gonna get away. Right. T. Ford slowed the car to a safer speed, just as a tractor came around the corner in the middle of the road. Damn! T. Ford screamed. Bubbles, how'd you know that? That tractor would be there. He moved over enough to the right, so both vehicles could pass and wave friendly-like to each other. Son, Bubbles began to pontificate. If something bad could happen, you got a plan on it actually happening. He leaned forward to pat T. Ford on the shoulder in a fatherly way. That's how to get to be 75 years old. Oh yeah, Bugsy added. That and a truckload of luck. Bubbles leaned back in his seat, comfortable now that they wouldn't die on a Sunday, which he thought would be just plain bad manners. We're almost there, boys, he continued softly to himself, supporting his thoughts on longevity. Yes, sir, planning and a fine moonshine to sip on a quiet night. Celebrate? Dolly poured slowly into 2 cut crystal glasses, halfway up with the amber liquor she so admired. She was feeling in control at the moment, sort of like when she had every kindergartner's attention when she announced movie time. Mr. J.J. Independence, a wanted man, was a different audience, quite different. He was intoxicatingly attractive suddenly, as if he had put the very thought in her mind.
Yes, celebrate, Jay,
She continued.
May I call you Jay?
No. Unfazed by that, she quickly continued with confidence.
JJ, we are here to celebrate our chance meeting outside the bakery, where we both discovered we are indeed together now.
She looked around with a theatrical, melodramatic lurch.
On a dangerous adventure.
JJ took the offered glass and held it up to toast, allowing her to move her glass against his. Aren't we supposed to be fleeing from the gangsters, you know, leaving town and all that drama? Dolly smiled knowingly.
Oh, those hill boys will be slow to get moving on a Sunday. They're probably still suffering from last night's activities.
The hill boys, okay, sure. But the gangster types, the Chicago crew, they seem a bit more, what's the word? Oh yeah, professional. JJ took a seat in his writing chair and pulled a fresh piece of paper through the new Royal typewriter, just as they both heard the 1932 Ford Model 18 V8 roar up the road, go past the barn, then reverse and turn into the gravel driveway leading up to the doors.
We've got nothing to worry about, JJ.
He smiled and adjusted the roller to move the blank paper up an inch to give it a nice header before any words might magically appear later. Typing briefly, he wrote, Surprise visit. Tentative title. Why is that, Dolly? JJ inquired. Why nothing? Absolutely nothing to worry about.
Oh, JJ, you know, I'm indestructible and beautiful. You've said it silently to yourself so many times.
He laughed lightly. I guess I have. Without so much as a knock on the barn door, the gangsters burst in, guns drawn, faces skewed up for a fight, and spitting tobacco juice all over the nicely polished pine floor. Hands up, Bubbles and Bugsy demanded in unison, surprising themselves enough to look at each other in surprise. Yeah, we're here for the donuts. T. Ford couldn't believe the words coming out of his mouth. Both Bubbles and Bugsy turned back to look at T. Ford, incredulous. What'd you say? Again, both Bubbles and Bugsy said the same words together. Gentlemen, gentlemen, and I use the term quite loosely, JJ announced, bringing his drink as he walked directly towards them. I'd invite you in, but you haven't yet apologized for bursting in on me and the sweet Miss Dolly. Just who do you think you are? Mr. Lying Newspaper Fool, Bugsy said while holding his hand up to keep Bubbles from saying the exact same words. JJ laughed and even went so far as to do so quite dramatically, well into the realm of fake guffawing. Who are you, I should implore, breaking into my home with guns drawn, spitting your tobacco juice all over the place, all while anyone can see none of you need any more damn donuts. Bugsy was getting quite flustered at this point. Fancy boy with your words all organized, Bugsy blurted out. I'm your worst nightmare. That's who I am, and this here is my gang. He waved one free hand toward the other two men, careful to keep his gun hand busy pointing at JJ. JJ nodded, taking a slow sip of his amber-colored liquor. I'm surprised you guys actually showed up. Really, I am. JJ shook his head in mild disbelief. In fact, it's not so much a nightmare as much as it could be a dream. Dolly came closer, putting her arm around JJ's waist.
JJ,
She whispered none too quietly.
why are they transparent?
Yeah, boys. Why are you looking transparent? Bugsy and Bubbles looked at each other. Then at T. Ford. Horror slowly built up in their eyes as they saw themselves not all quite there, and not in the familiar context of just being a little stupid either. What kind of voodoo is this? T. Ford yelled. Boss, what's going on? Bugsy, like most gangsters, when they get scared, quickly transitioned to anger, pointing his gun directly at Dolly. Okay, wise guy, what gives? Tell me now, or the dame gets it, right between those pretty blue... He paused, staring at Dolly, leaning his head slightly forward. I mean brown. He paused again. Wait, green, damn it, whatever color... eyes. Boys, you don't get it, do you? Of course not. How could you? I hardly believe it myself. But then I should be the least surprised. Dolly screamed as she too saw herself slightly transparent.
JJ, what have you done to me?
Walking back over to his typewriter, ignoring Bugsy and his gang, and feeling just a little guilty about Dolly, JJ the writer began typing. Words instantly appeared on the paper that said, Bugsy started rubbing the head of Bubbles and calling him a good dog. Instantly, Bugsy did exactly that. JJ continued. More words appeared on the paper that said, Dolly came up and gave JJ a big kiss on the cheek, thanking him profusely for saving the day.
Oh, JJ, you are my hero.
She leaned over enough to kiss him on the cheek.
You saved the day.
JJ looked up at everyone. See what's going on, kids? I'm going to shoot the place up a little so you can see what's going on. Bugsy had his own maniacal laugh perfected. These words appeared now on the paper. Bugsy's Tommy gun can only produce bubbles. No offence, Mr. Bubbles. No offence taken, Bubbles offered. T. Ford couldn't help but start laughing when the little soap bubbles came pouring out of Bugsy's gun. Boss, ain't that the darndest thing?
Stop it!
Dolly screamed.
Stop this, whatever it is you're doing.
She sat abruptly down on the couch across from JJ's desk, let her face hide in her hands, and wept.
I don't understand.
Bubbles was completely dumbstruck. There was no anger in his blood or fascination. There was only a heartbreaking level of disappointment spreading through his mind. He looked sadly at his hands, at his feet, then over to Bugsy and T. Ford. Dolly had the same issue. They all did. We're just characters in his typewriter. T. Ford was shocked. What the hell? JJ wrote, T. Ford curses in French. Que diable? Boss, I swear, I don't know no French words. Yeah, T. Ford, don't worry about it, Bugsy consoled. That ain't nowhere near as worse as my gun spitting soap bubbles. JJ leaned back in his high-winged chair, plopped his boot-covered feet up on the old writing desk, put his hands behind his head, and just stared for a moment. Stared at his characters, who in some Pinocchio fashion had come to life. Well, near enough to interact with. It was amazing, and like most writers, he felt a strong desire to monologue about it. You know, he began, back in English Lit class, which I attended only when I had nothing else to do, they told us about the dangers of fiction. Quickly, he leaned forward again to type. Bubbles, Bugsy, T. Ford and Dolly all gather around in rapt attention at JJ's monologue. Leaning back in the chair again, satisfied his captive audience was indeed paying attention and surging with an expanded ego, JJ continued. Like I was saying, some of the professors warned us about what we would create with our words. They said, be careful for one very important reason, that whatever we write creates a type of reality in the reader's mind. Dolly whispers none too softly.
That's so hot, JJ.
It really is, Dolly. In fact, they also said that every reader creates a unique scene in their head as they read. So, the writer composes one story, the one in their head, but it might propagate all through the universe in different forms, based on different readers. Proper what? T. Ford asked innocently enough. It means start off small, then go bigger, Bubbles explained. Oh, T. Ford grasped it better with an analogy, like the distilling operation. Bugsy got irritated that the so-called secret moonshine operation was being talked about so openly in front of non-investors, but then finally had his epiphany. So, Mr. Fancy Words newspaper man, are you telling us that our entire, I don't know, everything, our lives, is simply something you made up in your imagination? That's right, Bugsy. All of it, all of you, all of everything you've ever done, thought, did or did not do, in a book coming out before Christmas. Bubbles was shaking his head sadly. It had all been just a simple dream in some guy's head. It had seemed so real. Bugsy was diving deeper into the implications, though, leaving all the sadness stuff to the old man. So, all that Chicago money I'm responsible for, that went into this soon-to-be-busted distillery, thanks to your reporting, is not actually real? JJ thought for a moment how best to answer that very intuitive question, posed by a man who was 20% transparent. That's 80% visible for you math majors. Bugsy, I haven't finished the story yet. I was about to add a chapter about you guys getting flushed out by the New York feds, who then set the distillery on fire and get into a big gun battle with you guys. T. Ford brightened up with that. The man couldn't resist a good fight. Do I get to use my bubble gun? Bugsy asked sarcastically. JJ laughed. Even Dolly lightened up at that. No, you'll need the real thing, Bugsy, but I gotta tell you guys, it doesn't end well for you. Dolly was getting the drift of the scene here finally and stood up to walk over to JJ.
What about me, JJ?
She sat on the corner of his desk, looked over at the gangsters for the briefest moment, then toyed with the edges of the typewriter.
You gonna keep me around? For kicks?
Well, JJ said slowly, as he wrote a few scenes quickly in his head as he talked. I was going to have you kidnapped by these fine fellows here, held for ransom back in the hills. But when the feds break up the operation and there's gunfire, you manage to escape, through the mud, mind you, and find yourself quite lost in bear country. Of course, it's winter, so the bears are sleeping. Finally, you make it back to town. Having missed quite a few days of kindergarten, your kids really miss you, but you feel like this story really needs to get told proper and all, and not just the way that I'm making it up as I go along. So you invite another gang down, this one from Philly, to set up another moonshine operation in order to save the town of destination economically. A year later, you become the youngest mayor of any town in Kentucky.
Wow, JJ, I like that. I like that a lot. How about getting me into a nicer house and maybe some fine clothes, being mayor and all?
Hey, Bubbles interrupted. Leave the dame out of the entire story. This is a moonshine business, and she's got nothing to do with that. He turns to Dolly. No disrespect, ma'am, but this is a dangerous business. Guys getting plugged all the time. Go into prison favor and any number of horrible things a nice lady like you should not endure, or even be aware of.
JJ wants to make me pretty and all.
Dolly stood up straighter, throwing her shoulders back a bit to accentuate an angle all of them could easily appreciate.
And get me elected mayor.
T. Ford felt like he needed to defend Dolly from Bubbles' relatively harsh criticism, and moved next to her, putting his hand on her shoulder. Guys, Miss Dolly here is a strong woman. We can all see that. She's plenty darn pretty, and would make a damn fine mare. Hell, I'd vote for you as many times as I could get away with."
"Why, that's mighty kind of you, T-Bone,"
Dolly said. "That's T. Ford, Miss Dolly," Bugsy corrected. Turning, he segued. "So, Mr. JJ, let's make some adjustments to your story. Obviously, you can't afford an editor or even a proofreader from what I can gather." He turned to face the group. "We can help with that, right?" Everyone agreed, of course. "Well," JJ pondered, "I suppose you guys and gal might have some viable, good ideas and all. Let's start from just before you hooligans burst in this here barn, right before Miss Dolly was going to get all sweet on me."
"I was.
Dolly said with a big grin.
See, guys, I told you he likes me best."
T. Ford was a bit disappointed, and so had to correct Dolly. He never picked a favourite. Not yet, anyhow. "Give it a rest, y'all," Bugsy commanded. "We got some work to do here to clean up this mess JJ is about to walk himself into." "Wait," Bubbles interrupted. "I want out. If the feds bust my operation, I want out. I'm done running from the damn law." Okay, Bugsy said, pointing at the typewriter. "Get Bubbles a nice trailer down in Florida somewhere, near a Piggly Wiggly, so he can buy his cheap hooch at the package store and flirt with old ladies from Minnesota. After the feds raid us, though," Bubbles edited, "I still want to shoot a few of those bastards." "Does that sound good?" Bugsy continued. "T. Ford and I both want free shots at the feds, without us getting hit too. Got it?" JJ sat forward in his chair, folding his hands like a thoughtful man might do if he was having big thoughts. "I can't guarantee you won't at least get wounded, guys." "Sure you can. You're writing this stuff, aren't you?" "Listen," JJ explained. "When I get to writing, the words kind of go where they want to. My plot is about 4 or 5 lines, and from there, the flow happens. You know, the flow, like the vapors condensing in your distillery pipes. I just can't predict exactly how things are going to work out." Bugsy scratched his head a little, and then pulled up a chair. "No wonder you ain't got an editor. You'd be a nightmare to work with." T. Ford moved his chair up next to JJ now, watching the writer take notes. "It's okay, boss. We've had a few scraps where we needed some healing time. Remember Jersey, back in 28? We damn near bought the farm that night." He pulled up his sleeve. "I still got scars and all."
"Ooh."
Dolly exclaimed, quickly walking over to T. Ford.
"Can I touch them, T?"
"It's T. Ford, for God's sakes, ma'am," Bugsy corrected again. T. Ford looked up to Dolly with big appreciative eyes. "You can call me T." She ran her fingertips over the imperfectly healed skin, feeling a shiver of the drama that created them, then quickly composed herself and backed up a step.
"Does it hurt?"
"Nah, not for a long time now," T. Ford bragged, but he was feeling an unfamiliar kind of tingle. "I think I'm her favourite," he thought to himself. "Sounds to me like you all got too many chefs in the kitchen," Bubbles said, "and we know there can only be one cook in my kitchen." "I'm the damn cook," JJ corrected. "You all are feedback editors, okay?" Bugsy scratched his head again, turning to Bubbles. "There's a fancy word for an editor who ain't really an editor." He leaned forward in his chair to stare at JJ. "How you ever going to get published, sonny?" Pushing his fedora back on his head, he glanced over at T. Ford, getting all starry-eyed with Dolly, then again over to Bubbles, who was looking more and more transparent by the minute, then back to JJ. "You got to keep this story moving. Fast, like T. Ford drives. Kind of crazy, you know." T. Ford was still watching Dolly intently, but gave Bugsy a thumbs up without looking at him. "You need interesting characters, and I'll admit you've created some here, but—" He scratches his head again. "More drama. Way more. This is reading like one of those Everett Peacock stories. All nice and pretty, but no one is trying to take over the world kind of stuff." "Who?" JJ said. "Exactly," Bugsy says. "Now, about my character. I have a few requests." "Sure." JJ sharpens his pencil to take more notes, because he can't type any faster than a monkey can find a hidden banana. "Go ahead." Bugsy stands up, straightens his tie, and adjusts his hat just so it's about 15 degrees off level, per gangster specifications. So, after the fight with the feds, I go back up to Chicago to get my arm stitched up from the stray bullet that bounced off a copper kettle in the woods and grazed me just enough to make me curse a couple of times. He laughed and then quickly added, "No tears." JJ nodded, looking down at his paper, continuing to write. And once I get back in shape, I begin a takeover of the entire city. Booze, broads. Pardon me, Miss Dolly, but you know what I mean? Dolly nods as she continues rubbing T. Ford's shoulders. Yeah, all the speakeasies, all the politicians, all the hot dog stands. Mine, all mine. He brushes off the imaginary success from his sleeves as if it is too much. But just so we don't end up in a story like you-know-who you've never heard, of I need to get gunned down right there in the middle of Main Street in a city-wide ticker tape parade in my honor. Horrible tragedy. Women and children cry. Men put on sunglasses, and dogs whine all the night long. Sad, sad stuff. JJ was writing furiously. Got all that, Shakespeare? JJ nodded. Okay, and you've already got Bubbles escaping the fight with the feds to make his way on the top of a pile of coal on the night train to Tampa, where he, gets all retired and stuff. Yep, got that too. JJ looks over to Bubbles. You good with that? Bubbles nodded. Now, for T. Ford, Bugsy says, shaking his head at the teenage behavior between his driver and the kindergarten teacher, Dolly. Kids these days, right? Okay, T. Ford, what you want to happen to you? Bugsy quickly follow up with, except for what you're thinking at this moment. T. Ford is grinning like he hasn't grinned since he was known as T. Little Red Wagon. Make something up for me, boss. You always done me right. Bugsy tips his hat at his driver. Well then, let's have T. Ford survive the gunfight with the feds by gunning all of them down, destroying their 2 cars in a big ball of flame and somehow saving a 5-gallon bucket of the best and finest moonshine for us. He manages to convince Miss Dolly there to quit her school teaching days and come on adventure with him. First he follows me to Chicago, but after he almost dies trying to save me in the parade assassination, he and the dame go into hiding for a few months, before finally setting up in Canada somewhere, because there ain't no silly booze laws up there. Raise some children, live on a big ranch from all the money I bequeathed him, and grows old and happy with his tribe of tea-kits. JJ is scratching graphite on paper as fast as he can, thinking in the corner of his mind that these characters have a better grasp on their personalities and futures than he does. Thanks, boss, T. Ford says with a measurable amount of emotion in his voice. You always did take care of me. Big time. Wow, just wow to the max, JJ exclaims. This is Book of the Year stuff, Academy Award, Nobel Prize material. JJ gets quiet a minute, looks for his hidden bottle of Canadian whiskey in the bottom drawer, and pulls out 5 glasses. Folks, we need a proper toast using proper booze from T. Ford's and Dolly's eventual home, the Great White North of Canada. Everyone gathered around, and had 2 shots each, in fact, which, in the tradition of excess, is quite proper indeed. Bubbles and Bugsy made for the door after that, picking up their Tommy guns and wiping the soap bubble residue off. T. Ford and Dolly followed, arm in arm. Bring along Miss Dolly, T. Ford, Bugsy allows. Dolly, JJ said reluctantly, I thought you were sweet on me.
Yeah, I was, but you don't have any scars.
Sure, I do.
Where then?
She stops walking. They're all inside. That's why I write. To fix.
What good is a scar if you can't see the damn thing?
Dolly giggles at her new use of a curse word. It must feel real good. She is lightly stroking the scar on T. Ford's arm. JJ is a little disappointed, but hey, he'll write of another love interest if and when he gets over this one. You know, JJ added, I had you becoming a famous Hollywood actress, known the world over, but you died in a tragic set disaster when the elephant got loose.
Oh, JJ, honey.
Dolly says with every ounce of authenticity in her soul, and as she grabs T. Ford's butt.
I've got me some living to do first. Don't I, T?
Yeah, baby. Miss Dolly Sunshine, formerly of Destination Kentucky, looked back at her first love, and blew JJ a kiss, then whispered just loud enough to be heard over the roosters outside.
Kill me later.